Whenever you're ready, you tell me.
We're ready.
Okay. This is an interview with Frank Sobel. The day's in Hicksville, New York. It is the 19th of November, 2003, approximately 9 a.m. Interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Frank Sobel, June 30th, 1919, and I was born in New York City.
Okay.
My entire life really has been around New York City outside of the 4.5 years in the service. And that's my background.
Okay, what was your educational background prior to entering?
Actually, I was attending college at night when I was drafted into the service on the one-year draft.
Okay.
And,
Okay.
and basically, I foolishly did not go back to finish my schooling when I came out of the Army 2 days after Pearl Harbor. What am I saying, Pearl Harbor? VJ Day.
Okay. Do you remember where you were and your reaction when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Yes, it was a Sunday. I was in the service, just had returned from maneuvers in the Carolinas, and we were on a 3 or 5 day pass, I forget which, and the Sunday was the last day, and of course I didn't realize that anything had happened until I'd gone off to meet some friends, and why aren't I in uniform? And there was Pearl Harbor Day, and of course theoretically we were all supposed to return then and there back to barracks, and I delayed it by going out with some friends on the Sunday night and to one of the roadhouses up in the northern Westchester area, and sitting in the audience was Benny Goodman with the newspaper on the table, listening to the band or whatever was there, and it was a shocker seeing Benny Goodman, not a shocker really, but to see people reading the newspaper because of what happened at Pearl Harbor. And of course at that point I was in uniform, and I met one other GI, and he said, "Where am I going?" I said, "Well, I'm going back to Fort Dix once I finish off with my date and leave my friends." And I can't remember where he went, but and that was our exposure to Pearl Harbor. Of course, we knew that the war really was inevitable in light of the world circumstances and whatever else, but it's a shocker still.
So you were drafted
March
prior...
25th, 1941.
Okay, and you were to serve 1 year. Where did you go for your induction and your...
well, actually, from Whitehall Street, we boarded the train to go to Fort Dix. We were already in the service, and Fort Dix, we spent several days there, and I wound up at an infantry training at Camp Croft in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And after I can't remember whether it was a 6-week training or whatever it was. I'm vague on that part, but I was assigned to a military police unit that was newly organized or newly formed, supposedly combat military police, and that's where I remained.
Now, did you receive any specialized training to be in the military police, or?
Not really. Not really. To some degree, it was common sense. Being a dictator, fortunately, one of the enlisted men was a New York State trooper, and he was in the one-year draft because of he had joined a National Guard unit and came into the unit, and he was part of the unit, and he was very helpful to the officers in terms of what's right and what's wrong. But at that point, the battalion was split up. At the time of after Pearl Harbor, the battalion was split up, and 2 companies boarded out of New York City and we wound up in the Pacific.
Now, can I go back when you first went in March of '41? What kind of equipment did you have? Did you have the old World War I type helmets?
The old World War I helmet. We had the rifle.
1903.
The '03 rifle. That's what we did our training with, and the Garand had just come off, and I do believe we might have even shot the Garand during the infantry training. But it was I will say this, that the infantry training was really thorough. It was old Army, regular Army people who are cadre, and they put us through the mills. And being 21 years of age, it was easy to take, where the 36-year-olds were dragging their butts. But as I said, it was the start of the military career, and I guess in a sense I was fortunate that I wound up in the unit, and I'm here to talk about it.
So you ended up going out to the Pacific coast then?
Well, actually, we were 39 days on board ship. We left out of Brooklyn Army Base through the Panama Canal. We had one stop at Bora Bora where nobody got off ship in the convoy, and we landed in Brisbane, Australia, and my company wound up being stationed in the city of Melbourne for 6 months before we went into New Guinea. And I dare say that the 6 months was a very pleasurable experience. Lived right in the city, and we were doing the MP duties at that point, and
Did you have any problems with anybody?
no, none whatsoever, really. Really, as I think we were more protective to the GIs who might have had a little too much alcohol or whatever else than anything else. There was no abusive routines or whatever you might want to see happening.
What were your relationships like with the people? Did you have
Oh, with the
much?
civilians, though, they loved us. They loved us. And, of course, it was truly good living, because our duties were very simple in a sense. It was patrolling the city of Melbourne, and it was only when the 41st Division came down from camp on weekends that we saw any GIs other than a handful of people that was stationed within Melbourne proper. That was General MacArthur's headquarters when he came out of the Philippines.
Did you ever get to see him at all?
Oh yes, I saw him a number of times, and his family. He was, I think he and his family were living at the Menzies Hotel, which was one of the upgraded, very quiet residential type hotels.
What was your opinion of MacArthur?
I didn't have any true opinion really, because knowing of MacArthur's reputation when the World War I vets had the demonstration in Washington for bonus money or whatever and whatever. But really, it had no bearing, because he's a military man, and theoretically he knew what he was doing and whatever else. But other than seeing him on some rare occasion, because there was always a detail at the hotel, just in case or whatever, and but he was respected, I would assume, by most of the peoples. I guess some of the GIs who were left behind in the Philippines probably didn't like the fact that he was ordered out to get out of the Philippines, but I could understand his talent was very valuable.
Okay, after you left Australia, where did you go, and what were your assignments?
Well, we went into New Guinea. We landed in Port Moresby, and from there our company was, or a detachment of our company, because some of the people had been left back in Melbourne as MPs, and we wound up in tongue twisting in Milne Bay, and from there we broke up again, and I was in a detachment that went up to an area called Buna, where the heavier fighting was between the Japanese and the military. It was over the hump from Port Moresby. Port Moresby was to the west, and Buna, which is a tiny little nothing, was to the east, and that's where we were stationed for a while. Then we went up into Finchhaven, and from Finchhaven we were based there, and I went home on rotation in 1944. And I was left behind. One other person and I were left behind, and our detachment of about some 50-odd men went into the Philippines, into Luzon, to rejoin the balance of our company. And very fortunately, the ship, the troop ship that the unit was on, was kamikazed by a Japanese plane. And 11 of the men in our unit were killed, so I was fortunate in that sense, where I missed that little incident.
Now, what kind of assignments or duties did you have in Buna when you were up in kind
Basically,
of near the front lines?
it was a coordination of traffic and whatever else, a little bit of everything, I guess. It was a dock area where ships would come in with cargo, with supplies, and the same thing held true with Finchhaven, of course. But it was an isolated situation where once the fighting had ended in that part of Australia, there was just nothing but a stronghold of sitting and waiting for things to happen or the war to end.
Did you operate a motorcycle or a Jeep or anything like that?
Well, we had Jeeps.
Uh-huh.
We had Jeeps. Motorcycle, the roads were, the engineering feat of the engineer, where it was carving away part of a mountain that was very clay-like type material, very similar to the Carolinas, I guess. And on a rainy day, it was like ice. And the engineering feat of cutting through, the Australians used to comment, "By jive, you Yanks, you really do it," and they was totally amazed at what the engineering crew did. And we had a strong relationship with the Australians up there, and of course back to the Australians in Australia, the forces that we met with the home forces, where the actual fighting forces were in the Middle East at that point that we arrived, when we arrived to Australia. And but by the time we wound up in New Guinea, most of the forces were back from the Middle East, of the Australian contingents, and those were the people that we saw in New Guinea, that we worked with in New Guinea. I dare say one of the greatest treats we had was when the Australian bakery first set up, and we were rationed a slice of bread a day. It was like strawberry shortcake, in a sense of speaking. Living with sea rations was not the greatest.
Any problems with like tropical diseases or anything?
Oh yes, oh yes. Malaria was my main problem, and I was hospitalized a couple of times in Australia, in New Guinea, I should say. And of course, once when I came back from overseas, I was hospitalized, and it hasn't bothered me since, fortunately. But I can't give blood.
Right.
But other than that, there were a lot of the jungle rot that was created about there. The sad situation where one of the people in our unit was put onto a stretcher and put on board a hospital ship and wound up back in the States, and we thought he was a goner because of what he looked like, the weight that he'd lost and otherwise. But fortunately, we stumbled onto him in New York at one point, and he was well and alive and whatever else. And the unit I was with was originally a New York National Guard unit.
Yeah.
And they did have several reunions, but nothing followed through. We lost sight of everybody.
Uh-huh. So there's nobody you keep in touch with today?
No, nobody from the service. At various points, one of the people knocked on my door. He was electioneering for one of the sheriff's position for one of the parties. I can't remember which. And we look at one another. I know you, and lo and behold, we were in the same unit. And he put on weight, and I guess I did as well. But that was, oh gosh, it had to be 15 years later or whatever.
Uh-huh.
Now, when you were discharged when were you discharged?
August 17th, 1945,
Okay.
2 days after VJ. I was stationed in New York City doing MP duty on Times Square. And VJ Day happened. The next day we were into Fort Dix for discharge, and we were civilians.
Were you caught up in the celebration when the war ended?
Yeah, that's only from the level of still doing MP duty.
Mm-hmm.
That was my last day that I was probably on the Times Square detail.
Uh-huh.
But we had no involvement really, because there was nothing to concern yourself about except worrying about some of these people who might be a little intoxicated. And that was taking care of them, if we can phrase it as such.
So you didn't have all the women coming up and kissing you like you've seen in the Life magazine?
I guess on that day we were not as obvious or as we might have been.
Uh-huh.
Because my duty, more often than not, was either being in one of these staff cars for emergency, because we were hooked into New York City Police radio, or I can't remember anything really that was exciting or whatever.
Do you remember where you were and your reaction when you heard about the death of President Roosevelt?
Oh, I sure do. I was assigned to go up on detail to the funeral at Hyde Park, and I turned to the person in command and charge, and I said I'd rather not go. I've got a date here, and it didn't mean enough to me that I wanted to go up on a special detail. It was probably a mistake on my part, but at that point I just didn't want to take on that volunteer bit. But many people said I was a fool for not going because it was history.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember your reaction when you heard about the dropping the atomic bombs?
We were delighted. Our saying was, save the life of one GI, and we had no feeling to the lives of the Japanese. I know it's not humane in a sense, but this was our feeling, or at least my feeling, and most of the people around me.
Did you join any veterans organizations?
No, I did not. I am not a joiner in that sense. And I do know several people that I'm friendly with now are part of an American Legion unit, but I still don't have that interest. Now, the person I was talking to you about before we came on to the interview, Well, he felt as I did. He was a loner, and somehow or other they came to him for some advice, and he did offer his advice and did things for them and whatever else. And suddenly he's in the middle of a lot of heavy duty.
Did you ever make use of the GI Bill?
No, regrettably, because at the point that I should have gone back to school at that point and taken advantage of the GI Bill and finished my schooling. Although I'm not unhappy for how I wound up in the business world, but I still have the feeling that education is a very important way of life, and people never have enough knowledge.
Did you ever use the 5220 Club?
For a tiny little bit, until I found a situation that I went to work at.
How do you think your time in the service may have changed or affected your life?
Well, it had to be a radical change because, as I said, I was a student at college by night and working a day job, and that, of course, ended. And when I came out of the service, I felt that I was too old to go back to school, which was a mistake. And but it would have been, I think, from the sense of my self-being, I would have been happier having completed schooling, having completed college at any rate. But that was yesterday's newspaper.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
My going home on rotation and the unit going in and 11 of the guys being killed.
What was it like going home? I mean, was there a big celebration? I'm sure your family must have been
Well,
delighted to see
actually, it was a great celebration. There was a 30-day leave when we came home, and Mayor LaGuardia sent a note to the house welcoming me back and whatever else. And that was a nice little bit, a nice little touch.
Did you keep that?
Yeah, I still have it in my album. That's a keepsake. And of course the reassignment, we went up to Lake Placid. That was in February, I guess, of 45. We went up to Lake Placid for a 7-day stay or 10-day stay at the Lake Placid Club and reassignment, and I wound up being reassigned to New York City with an MP unit, and we were all overseas veterans in that unit. Infantry, God knows whatever. Whoever came home from overseas.
Any funny experiences or anything?
Well, one of the bits that happened along there, we were stationed in New York City, and periodically they sent us to Fort Dix for orientation or whatever, and one of the people in the unit was an American Indian by the name of, his last name was Page. He was a sergeant, and he was the sole survivor of his squad wiping out a German nest of machine guns. And there was a lot of kidding around with the people in the unit. Hey, Paige, what do you think of these POWs doing KP, doing the duty? And he said, I'd just as soon kill them as look at them. He still had that hatred. I don't imagine that hatred exists in his body today. But this is one of the things. When you talk of various things, a little horsing around, there was a tiny little, I can't remember his name, but he was in the Rangers, and he was shot up, and he had a plate in his head. And horsing around, they turned him upside down or whatever. He says, don't ever do that. He says, I black out because of my plate. I mean, so no matter what you did or where you were, there's always some sort of a scar that bears you stay with on something of that sort.
Did you ever get to see any USO shows or anything?
In New Guinea, yes.
Uh-huh.
In New Guinea, yes. Ray Bolger, Joey Lewis. Oh, I can't remember. I can't think of who else, but and there it was off in the jungles with a impromptu stage, and everybody sitting around on the ground and being entertained.
Do you have any other stories you want to relate, or?
Well, as I said, basically, some stories you don't bear repeating, but if the camera's off, I would tell you the incident, but
All right, I can
Yeah.
turn it off.